Welcome to today's deep dive. We're taking a look at something really fascinating today, specifically for you if you've ever shared a living space.
Yeah, it's one of those topics that seems super niche at first, but honestly applies to almost everyone.
Exactly. So picture the most sweeping cinematic image you can possibly conjure. Um, Maybe it's I don't know, a vast untouched coral reef teeming with life.
Or like a really dense, ancient rainforest with that thick mist just hanging over the canopy.
Right, right. And there, standing in the middle of it all, speaking in that iconic, hushed, reverent tone, is Sir David Attenborough.
Oh yeah, you can hear his voice just thinking about it.
Totally. And he's probably whispering about the delicate balance of an ecosystem, where every single organism plays this crucial interconnected role. I mean, it is grand, it is global. It's the very definition of epic.
It really is, and I think when we hear his name or, think of his philosophies, our minds automatically default to that macro level.
Yeah, the big picture stuff.
Right. We think about the survival of the entire planet, the migratory patterns of whales, or preserving these just vast biomes.
And here's where today's mission really kicks in. What happens if we take that massive planetary lens and zoom all the way in, like way in, and focus it on, say, a crumpled wet towel left on a bathroom floor?
Or a sink that's just full of dirty mugs.
Exactly. Because today we are unpacking a really profound guide. It's titled, What a Boarder Can Learn from David Attenborough: Responsibility, Stewardship, and Caring for What We Share.
It's such a brilliant framing, isn't it?
It really is. The big idea here, the core premise we're exploring, is that living in a boarding house or a student dormitory, really any shared living situation, is fundamentally an exercise in sharing.
Yeah, sharing spaces, routines, responsibilities.
Right. And in those shared spaces, individual behaviors matter far, far more than people usually realize.
Because when you have dozens of people living together in close quarters, you essentially have a captive habitat.
A micro-ecosystem.
Exactly. And what this source material does so well is it takes Attenborough's lifelong message, that the world is something we must actively look after, not something we just use without a second thought. And it maps that directly onto the architecture of daily communal life.
It totally shifts the paradigm of what it means to actually reside somewhere. So let's get into the first big shift. To understand how a global nature documentarian is relevant to a student dormitory, we first have to look at Attenborough's core definition of stewardship.
Right, which is really about taking ownership of the impact you have.
Yeah. And according to the text, in a boarding house, this translates to respecting shared spaces. It means taking care of the furniture, the facilities, leaving areas exactly as you would want to find them.
It's that core understanding that your physical footprint, no matter how small, directly affects the people around you.
I kept thinking about this in terms of a national park. Like when you go to Yosemite or Yellowstone, the golden rule is leave no trace. Right?
Absolutely. The classic rule.
You don't snap branches off trees for fun, and you definitely don't leave your granola bar wrapper sitting on the trail. You act as a temporary steward of that space, so the next hiker gets the exact same pristine experience.
That's a great analogy because the leave no trace ethos requires this deliberate suppression of your own convenience for the sake of the collective good.
Like carrying your trash out even when your backpack is heavy.
Exactly. You do it because your cognitive boundary of empathy actually extends to the hikers who are going to arrive tomorrow.
Okay, I get that in nature, right? But let me play devil's advocate for a second. Let's be realistic about human behavior indoors.
Sure.
If I'm paying room and board for a temporary living situation, especially when I'm a teenager, isn't it economically closer to a hotel room?
That is the exact trap a lot of people fall into.
Right. Because in a hotel, you expect someone else is going to come in, make the bed, swap out the towels, wipe down the counters. You're literally paying to be a user of that space.
Yeah.
So why shouldn't a boarder just default to letting the cleaning staff handle it?
It's a fair question. And the text addresses this by drawing a really sharp distinction between being a user of a community versus being a caretaker of it.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, the hotel mindset is the default setting for a lot of temporary living situations because, frankly, consumer culture trains us to be users. You pay money, you receive a clean room, and the relationship essentially ends there. It's entirely transactional.
You extract value from the environment.
Precisely. A user extracts value, but a caretaker sustains the value. A boarding house is not a hotel. It's a communal space.
Right. There isn't a magical team of invisible staff turning over your room every 4 hours.
Exactly. So when you operate as a user in a communal space, You are actively degrading the habitat for everyone else.
Because you're relying on the people living right next to you to absorb the impact of your mess.
Yes. When you have a user mindset, your cognitive boundary ends at your own immediate needs. Your internal monologue is just, I'm done with this plate, so I'll leave it here. You outsource the consequence of that plate to the environment.
But the caretaker realizes that plate in the sink prevents the next person from washing their dishes.
Right. You aren't just residing in a building anymore. You are an active participant in maintaining a micro-community.
Which perfectly brings us to segment 2, how this maintenance actually happens in the trenches of daily life. Because once we establish this caretaker mindset, we have to look at the actions. And according to the text, stewardship at a dorm isn't about grand sweeping gestures.
Not at all. It's about the cumulative power of micro-actions.
Yeah, Attenborough frequently talks about how small actions repeated over time have an immensely powerful environmental impact. And the source maps this directly to boarding life.
The health of a macro ecosystem, like a coral reef, depends on billions of polyps doing their tiny, specific jobs.
Right.
And the health of a boarding house depends on residents performing highly mundane, repetitive tasks.
And the examples the text gives are, honestly, painfully mundane. Yeah. It's tidying up after yourself, switching off lights and devices, respecting quiet times.
Looking after shared equipment.
Yeah, exactly. Being considerate of noise. But let's be real. Turning off a light switch or keeping your music down doesn't exactly feel heroic. It doesn't feel like saving the rainforest. It just feels like a chore.
I know. We're so conditioned by media to view impact as something dramatic and highly visible.
Totally. We want the cinematic moment.
Right, but in an actual ecosystem, survival isn't about heroism, it's about equilibrium.
Equilibrium. I like that.
Yeah. The goal in a boarding house isn't to save the world before breakfast. It's just to maintain the equilibrium of the immediate habitat so everyone inside it can function.
Let's actually look at the noise example that text highlights, because I think that illustrates this equilibrium concept perfectly. In a shared environment, uncontrolled noise isn't just a minor annoyance.
No, it's a major disruptor.
The text suggests it's actively consuming a shared resource.
Noise functions almost exactly like an invasive species in a microhabitat.
An invasive species. That is such a good way to put it.
Think about the physiological effects of noise pollution in a dorm. When one person chooses to, say, blast music at midnight, that sound travels through thin walls, through shared ventilation.
And it predictably spikes cortisol levels in the people in the adjacent rooms.
Exactly. It fragments their concentration, it disrupts their REM sleep.
Right.
That single action literally degrades the livability of the habitat for the surrounding population.
It actively consumes the finite resource of focus and rest.
Right. And conversely, when you choose to put on headphones, you are making a deliberate ecological choice to preserve the peace of the habitat.
Wow. Okay, yeah.
As the text points out, no single action feels dramatic in isolation. But consider the tragedy of the commons. Imagine a house where 50 students all decide on the exact same day that their individual convenience matters more than the equilibrium.
Oh, man. They leave their trash in the hall, leave every light on, blast their speakers.
The environment instantly collapses into chaos.
The ecosystem just fails.
Completely. The underlying logic here is that these microactions are the very fabric of the environment everyone must survive in. Every time you wipe down a counter, you're reinforcing the structural integrity of your own habitat.
It's like life by 1,000 tiny kindnesses, which naturally shifts our focus to the long-term impact. Because the next Attenborough principle highlighted in our source is thinking about the future, long after we are gone.
Right, planting trees whose shade you'll never sit in.
Exactly. For boarders, long-term thinking means understanding that how you treat your house today directly affects the students who will live there after you. And furthermore, it's about personal growth.
Which is a heavy developmental lift, by the way.
Oh, for sure.
Neurologically speaking, the teenage brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, is still developing its capacity for long-term planning and impulse control. It is biologically wired to prioritize short-term rewards.
Oh, so asking a teenager to practice long-term ecological stewardship over a dormitory is literally asking them to work against their own immediate neurological impulses.
Exactly. It is hard work.
But the text argues that this friction is exactly why it's so important. It says that the habits formed in boarding follow you into adult life. Boarding teaches you how to live well with others, which is a skill that matters way beyond school.
Oh, infinitely more.
Reading this, it really felt like the boarding house is essentially a low-stakes flight simulator for being a functional adult in society.
Oh, I love that. The flight simulator analogy holds up perfectly.
Because in a simulator, you get the muscle memory, right?
Yeah, you experience turbulence, you learn the complicated controls, and you make your mistakes in an environment where a crash doesn't cost lives.
Right.
In a boarding house, you're learning the complicated social controls of cohabitation. You learn how to negotiate boundaries, how to compromise, and how to manage your own footprint in a somewhat insulated, supervised environment.
Because if you don't build that consideration muscle and learn how to clean up your own mess when you're 17.
You are going to struggle immensely when you're 25, sharing an apartment in a new city with roommates who are not going to be nearly as forgiving as a housemaster.
Absolutely not. They will just kick you out.
Exactly. And the text highlights a crucial concept here regarding that. Responsibility is about consistency, not convenience.
Consistency, not convenience. Okay, say more about that.
Well, convenience is basically the natural enemy of stewardship. Let's say it's 11 p.m., you've just finished studying, and you made a snack. It is objectively more convenient to leave the dirty pan on the stove and just go to sleep.
Your short-term reward system is screaming at you to choose convenience.
Yes, but the flight simulator of the boarding house requires you to override that impulse. By choosing consistency, washing the pan even when you're tired, even when you really don't want to, you are physically rewiring your own behavioral pathways.
You're training yourself to be a contributing member of a community.
You're building a sustainable behavioral model that will dictate how you interact with literally every future environment you enter.
It totally reframes the concept of chores. You aren't just, cleaning a kitchen. You are actively conditioning your future self. I feel like changing the why behind the action really diminishes the resentment we usually feel toward tasks we don't want to do.
It absolutely does.
Which brings us to our final segment, the intersection of the physical space and the human element. Because this long-term mindset of care doesn't just stop at the walls or the carpets or the furniture. Place and people cannot be separated.
Right, they're deeply intertwined.
The text notes that Attenborough shows deep respect for nature, cultures, and communities simultaneously. He doesn't just look at a landscape and ignore the people inhabiting it.
No, the people are part of the ecosystem.
Right. And in a boarding house, the text says this translates to treating people kindly, respecting differences, and caring for the physical environment all at once. Because shared spaces physically reflect shared values.
We can actually view this through the lens of the broken windows theory.
Oh, right, the criminology theory.
Exactly. The theory basically suggests that visible signs of disorder and misbehavior in an environment encourage further disorder. If a window in a building is broken and left unrepaired, people assume that no one cares and no one is in charge.
Which just leads to more windows being broken.
Exactly.
So if you apply that to, like, a dorm common room, if you walk in and the couches are torn, there's garbage on the floor, and the lights are flickering and buzzing, that physical environment is communicating something very clear to you about how that community values its members.
It communicates neglect, plain and simple. And when an environment communicates neglect, the people inside it feel neglected.
That makes total sense.
The text points out that when boarders take pride in their environment, it creates a much stronger sense of belonging. The ultimate payoff is that when they practice stewardship, the environment feels calmer, people feel respected, and the building actually transforms into a true home.
The link there between the physical state of a room and emotional safety is so strong. I mean, we usually think of physical safety in terms of locks on doors or fire alarms.
Sure, the basic security stuff.
Right, but emotional safety seems deeply tied to the care of the environment itself.
Well, think about it. How can you feel emotionally safe and respected in a place that is physically disrespected by your peers?
You really can't.
Right. If a roommate carelessly damages a shared space, they are indirectly signaling that they do not value your shared experience.
Wow, yeah.
But when everyone actively participates in caretaking, it creates this continuous silent dialogue of mutual respect. It says, I care about this space, which means I care about your experience in this space.
And this leads right to the text's core thesis. Responsibility in a boarding house is not about enforcing rules. It is fundamentally about care.
Which is a huge distinction.
If we look at this through behavioral psychology, it's really the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation.
Oh, absolutely. Teenagers and, honestly, humans in general instinctively resist extrinsic motivation. Rules feel imposed from the outside. Turn off the lights by 10 p.m., clean the kitchen.
If it's just a rule, people do the bare minimum required to avoid punishment.
Exactly. But if it's framed as care, it becomes an internal value. Intrinsic motivation takes over. You aren't cleaning the kitchen because the housemaster will give you a demerit if you don't. You're cleaning it because you've taken ownership of the ecosystem.
You actually care that your friend has a clean space to make breakfast tomorrow.
And that intrinsic motivation is vastly more sustainable than the extrinsic motivation of strict dorm rules. David Attenborough's entire legacy is built on fostering that exact intrinsic motivation on a global scale.
Just reminding us that stewardship is about looking after what we have, so it can be enjoyed by others, now and in the future.
Right. And the source text really demonstrates that boarding life offers a daily, granular chance to practice that exact kind of global stewardship. It takes the macro and makes it micro.
Every single day is an opportunity to be a caretaker of your habitat.
And those behavioral pathways you build in that habitat, they will dictate your trajectory as an adult.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, think about your own life. Whether you are currently sharing a dorm room or, you haven't seen the inside of student residence in 20 years.
You're still part of an ecosystem.
Exactly. You are always part of a shared ecosystem. How you treat your immediate environment shapes the lived experience of everyone in that space. We've spent this time exploring how treating a student boarding house with Attenborough's level of ecological stewardship transforms a group of temporary roommates into a thriving, respectful community.
And those principles hold up regardless of the scale or the setting.
They really do.
Huh.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over today. If this concept works so well in a dormitory, let's zoom back out to the adult world.
Okay.
What other temporary shared spaces in your adult life are secretly suffering right now?
Oh, that's a good question.
Right. Think about your office break room. Think about your local coffee shop. Or even our shared digital communities like comment sections and forums. Are those spaces chaotic, stressful, and depleted because people are walking into them acting merely as users, expecting someone else to absorb the impact of their mess?
It's entirely possible.
So what would happen tomorrow if you walked into those spaces and decided to operate as the caretaker?
It would probably alter the entire dynamic of the habitat.
From the vast rainforest to the office kitchen sink, we are all stewards of the space we occupy. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.